Hi, welcome to Hypervisor Backups for Hyper-V for the Unitrends Certified System Administration course. By the end of this module, you'll be able to determine which backup approach to use based on your Hyper-V configuration. You'll also be able to configure and run Hyper-V backups using the Unitrends best practices. First, we're going to take a look at determining your backup approach. How you back up your Hyper-V guests really depends on, first of all, your virtual machine configuration, but also your data retention and data recovery requirements. We're going to take a look at the Unitrends best practices around those two, but we're also going to look at Microsoft's best practices for protecting Hyper-V as well. Your backup approach really depends on your implementation and your recovery requirements, as we talked about earlier. You want to run Unitrends Hyper-V snapshot backups to recover the entire virtual disk really quickly, the entire virtual machine. We can also include auto-renew VMs in a default schedule. So if you add a new hypervisor guest, it's going to be picked up in one of your default schedules. We can also do rapid disaster recovery of failed VMs using Hyper-V's instant recovery. And we can also do mounting of the virtual disks for file and folder and application recovery from within inside of your Hyper-V virtual snapshots. Now the other approach is the agent-based, and this is OR. You can't run both of these, but you can run an agent file level and the application backups if you need to include or exclude any volume directories, files, or folders. There is no exclusions on Hyper-V snapshots. If you need to run a pre or post command in the backup to start or stop databases or services before and after the backup, you can do that through our agent. You also may have to run an agent file level backup or the application backups if you've mapped any shared VHDXs and you have any VMs with paths through disks, or if it's a cluster with single cluster shared volume. If it's a cluster server with a single cluster shared volume, you also want to run an agent across it. The virtual snapshots cannot snapshot those configurations. The snapshot is preferred when supported. Always try to run that snapshot first and foremost. The easiest way to bring machines back is from a virtual snapshot. But the agent approach is preferred when running SQL or Exchange on Hyper-V. If you're running SQL or Exchange servers in Hyper-V, you should just treat it like a physical server and run our agent across everything. Across file and folder to protect the OS, integrated bare metal, and run application backups across SQL and Exchange. Once again, only run one of these methods, not both. On the same servers, you can't run Hyper-V snapshots and file-level backups against those same machines. Now, running a file-level backup directly on an application database won't achieve the same desired results. I can't recover that database by running a file-level backup. Make sure you run that native backup first if you want to be able to recover the application from within that virtual snapshot. Same thing with our file level backup. Same thing with the virtual snapshot. Some of those databases, those applications, I may have to run a native backup even though I'm running a virtual snapshot to bring that database back. Using Hyper-V snapshots, you can achieve both fast OS recovery and individual item restores. Some people, they've always shied away from virtual snapshots because they thought they couldn't bring back files or folders or applications. We can. From a hypervisor snapshot, from a full or an incremental, I can recover files and folders and objects, and I can recover the entire crashed server. We can mount that virtual snapshot off the appliance so you can copy out files and folders and objects. We talk about setting up your Hyper-V backups and setting up those snapshots. To set up your Hyper-V backups, you'll need to first install the required components. You'll configure your environment based on the servers that you have. You'll also make sure you consider your schedules around your recovery point objectives based on your recovery needs. Once again, we can't tell you to run the same schedule everywhere based on your recovery needs. Also, once again, make sure you have storage and free space requirements met to make sure you can back up those servers. Make sure you have room to fit the footprint of the machines you're going to do virtual guest snapshots on. We're also going to show you how to create the recommended backup jobs as well too. When we first talk about verifying and installing the required components, first of all, you have to make sure you install the Unitrends agent, and it has to be the same agent on all Hyper-V hosts in that cluster. The Unitrends agent must be installed and the same version on all hosts in that Hyper-V cluster. You also must make sure you have Microsoft Volume Shadow Copy Service turned on VSS. We utilize VSS through the agent to snapshot those virtual machines at the disk level through Hyper-V. That's why it also needs the Hyper-V VSS writer. Those two work in tandem together. You also need to make sure you have the latest version of integration services for online backups as well, too. All right, we'll talk about the online backup process here in a little bit, what the difference is with online or save state. When we do talk about online backups, to ensure no downtime, first of all, Unitrends system initiates the backup. Unitrends agent creates the VSS point in time consistent based on that snapshot. Then that host triggers the snapshot of that VM, and then the snapshot is copied through the host to the Unitrends system, the Unitrends appliance. Now, to make this all happen so you don't have any downtime, the VMs and their VHDX files and snapshot file location must be to the same volume in the host OS. They must all be on that same volume. They can't go to different volumes to grab the different VHDXs. All volumes in the child VM are basic disks and there are no dynamic disks. All disks in the child VM must use a file system that supports snapshots. All right, if an online backup cannot be performed, the virtual machine is temporarily put into a save state. Once again, in that save state, there's brief downtime associated with the backup process. Depending on the size of the machine, the longer it can take the snapshot, the more downtime you could possibly see on your network with that server, that node. If your Hyper-V VM has remote storage, you need to make sure you have the following in place to run a job successfully. File server and file server VSS agent services roles must be installed on the server hosting the SMB 3.0 shares. That's a file server and the file server VSS agent services role. The Unitrends agent on the Hyper-V host must be granted read-write access to the remote shares as well. The servers hosting the VM and the SMB shares must belong to the same domain, and that's pretty common. Also, one or more disks can reside in the same share or different shares hosted by one or more servers in the same domain. Once again, if they're all off that same host, they can be on the same or different shares hosted by one or more servers in the same domain, too. A few Hyper-V backup considerations. When you check your configuration, if it's a standalone Hyper-V server, the number of jobs that run simultaneously is determined by the maximum concurrent backup setting. So if I have 10 concurrent connections, I'm going to run 10 backup jobs at a time against that standalone Hyper-V server, backing up all those guests. Now, if I'm configured for clustered shared volume, CSVs, prior to Windows 2012 R2, you want to make sure you use the cluster IP, or you want to back up from the replica or the third-party node, the duplicate copy, back up from there. Do not back up duplicate or active. Windows Server 2008 backups performed one at a time. I could queue up 10, have 10 concurrent connections. Those could be the only 10 in the group, but it's going to go through each one of those guests one at a time. If I have cluster shared volume CSVs, Windows 2012 and later or prior to that, it's going to only queue them one at a time. Few considerations for clustered virtual machines. When adding the cluster nodes, you want to make sure you register both nodes first, then register the cluster instance IP from the failover cluster manager as the third client. When you add that cluster node, if you have more than one host, you're going to put the agent on each one of those hosts, and you're going to register each one of those hosts. But for the cluster, you're going to register and manage from the cluster instance IP. Now, you're also going to enter the correct host name and IP address for every node in the cluster, as I mentioned. The cluster also requires a DNS name in DNS, by the way. Backups will fail if the appliance can't determine the owner of the virtual machine in the cluster configuration. So if you have it sitting on one host and the agent isn't there and it can't determine the configuration, it's going to fail. The agent must be on all nodes in the cluster. You're going to register all nodes in the cluster. Then you're also going to register the cluster instance IP as a third client, as an extra client. That's the client you're going to manage them from. In some cases, you may need to utilize the auto-include new virtual guests. If I move virtual machines from one host to another, I've got multiple hosts and I'm not setting up clustering, and I move one machine to another, the auto-include with a schedule is going to pick up that move when that guest moves from one host to another. Here's a few of the best practices for Hyper-V backups. Incremental forever is our recommended strategy for the vast majority of Hyper-V guests out there. You can have exceptions based on server growth and needs and recovery point needs, but incremental forever is the recommended strategy for the majority of our Hyper-V guests. Make sure you're following Microsoft's best practice for virtualization and virtualized Active Directory servers and distributed file system environments. All three of those have specific Microsoft best practice for backup and recovery and protection. Make sure on any of those platforms for Hyper-V, you're familiar with the Hyper-V administrative backup and recovery pieces and how those work. Make sure you're following those as well when you schedule and use our product. For online backups, install the latest version of integration services. We called that out earlier. If you want to avoid downtime with your servers, make sure you've got integration services turned on. After making any configuration changes to a virtual machine in Hyper-V Manager, run a new full backup. It's going to prompt you in most cases within the Unitrends appliance that something has changed in the configuration and it needs to promote the next scheduled backup to a full. But you want to avoid that error and the delay. You know you made the change. Turn around and run a full backup. Once again, do not run Hyper-V backup or snapshots for virtual machines that you're protecting at the guest OS level through our agent-based file level backups. Don't run both. If you do run both, doing so, it can compromise some logs in there. Screw up some of those truncation changes for some applications. Once again, there may be some exceptions based on your environment, but for the most part, if you're going to choose the virtual snapshot and run guest level backups, you're not going to do anything with the agent. And if it is running SQL or Exchange, you pretty much want to treat it like a physical server, use the agent file level backups and the application-based backups to protect the SQL and the Exchange databases. Next, we're going to watch the how-to video tutorial for creating and managing Hyper-V backups.